The rain fell over Rome like a whispered confession, steady, patient, almost compassionate. It washed the color from the city, leaving only the soft glow of street lamps reflected on wet cobblestones. Inside a small apartment, not far from Piazza Bologna, a man sat alone, the smoke from his cigarette curling in the dim yellow light. His name was Tommaso Buscetta, once a prince among thieves, a man who had dined with killers and called them brothers. Now he was hiding from them all. He sat by the window, his silhouette framed against the glass. Beyond it, the rain blurred the outlines of the world, just as time had blurred the lines between loyalty and survival in his life. The air carried the scent of cold tobacco and memory. On the table lay an untouched glass of whiskey and a faded photograph, Palermo, decades ago. When the world still made sense to him, he had been many things in his life: a smuggler, a negotiator, a diplomat of the underworld. But tonight, he was something rarer, a man on the edge of truth. The city outside murmured faintly, cars, distant thunder, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. Yet inside, everything was still. They say that betrayal begins long before the act itself, that it starts quietly, in the heart, as a whisper that refuses to die. For Buscetta, that whisper had lived inside him for years. He had seen too much, buried too much, loved too deeply to keep silent forever. He drew a long breath, watching the smoke drift toward the ceiling. Once, that smoke had been the symbol of power, the room filling with cigar haze as men made decisions that shaped cities. But now it was only a ghost like him, Tommaso Buscetta, the gentleman of the Mafia, a man who wore suits in a world of killers, who preferred charm over cruelty, diplomacy over violence. He had believed that the Mafia was an empire of honor, a code of respect in a lawless land. But honor, he had learned, was a fragile thing, easily spoken, easily broken. The rain deepened outside, its rhythm steady as breath. He remembered Palermo, the narrow streets that smelled of sea salt and lemons, the laughter of children echoing off stone walls. He had grown up there, beneath a sky that promised little and delivered less. The Mafia had been more than temptation, it was destiny. For a boy with nothing, it offered everything: respect, belonging, the illusion of control over fate. He exhaled slowly, eyes distant. How far he had come from those days, and how far he had fallen. He thought of the men he once called brothers, men who toasted with him at weddings, who kissed him on both cheeks, who later ordered his sons to be slaughtered. He thought of the oath he swore in blood, the vow of silence that had defined him. Omerta, the sacred code. It was supposed to be eternal, but eternity, he now knew, was shorter than regret. There was a knock once, soft, deliberate, echoing from memory. He remembered the sound vividly, from years ago in Sicily. A knock like that always meant news, and news was rarely good. He had opened the door to find eyes full of pity. That was how he learned his sons were gone. He crushed his cigarette against the ashtray and lit another. The gesture was mechanical, almost ritualistic, something to fill the silence between thoughts. He had learned to survive by keeping his mind busy, but tonight his mind would not obey. It wandered through his past like a ghost through empty corridors. He thought of the faces Falcone, Rena Bontaide, each one a different shade of the same story. Some had called him traitor, others hero. But Buscetta had stopped believing in labels long ago. Truth, he thought, was heavier than either. The rain softened, turning into a gentle drizzle. It sounded like memory itself, relentless but forgiving. In that sound, he found both comfort and condemnation. He closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, Palermo bloomed again. The market stalls, the church bells, the men in crisp suits and quiet voices. He remembered the laughter, the wine, the way the old dawns spoke of family as if it were holy scripture. He remembered believing them, but the family had turned on itself. The old order, the Cosa Nostra of honor and restraint, had been consumed by greed and blood. Buscetta had watched it rot from within, powerless to stop it. He had fled once, thinking distance would save him. But the Mafia was not something one escaped. It was a ghost that followed, patient and invisible. He took a sip of whiskey, his first of the night, and felt the burn trace down his throat. The rain outside flickered in the light, like static on an old film reel. Somewhere in the city, he knew there were still men looking for him. Men who believed that silence was sacred, that betrayal was worse than death. They would not rest until he was gone, and yet, despite the danger, despite the fear, he felt something unexpected stirring inside him. Not courage, that was too romantic a word. It was something quieter, a kind of weary truth. He had spent his life keeping secrets, but secrets have weight. They anchor the soul, pulling it deeper into darkness with every passing year. And tonight, under the grey Roman sky, Tommaso Buscetta was tired of sinking. He reached for the photograph again, the one of Palermo, and turned it over. On the back, in faded ink, were two words, La Famiglia. He smiled faintly. The family, the word that had given him everything, and taken everything in return. The rain grew heavier again, tapping gently against the window pane, as if urging him to speak. Outside, the city was asleep. Inside, a man was waking up. He took a final drag of his cigarette, exhaled, and whispered softly, as if to no one at all, "Maybe it's time." And with those words, the story of silence began to unravel. The rain, indifferent and eternal, kept falling, washing away the sins of men, one breath at a time. Asterisk, he was born in a city that always seemed to sweat, even when the wind blew from the sea. Palermo, a place where the scent of oranges could not hide the bitterness of gunpowder, where men spoke softly but carried the weight of generations on their shoulders. In 1928, the streets were cracked and sunburnt, stitched together by whispers. Behind every wooden door was a story, and behind every story, a shadow. It was here that Tommaso Buscetta took his first breath, his first steps, and his first lessons in survival. He came from poverty, the kind that crept into bones. His family had little scraps of bread, old wine, a roof that leaked when the rain came. Yet around him, he saw men who seemed untouchable. They wore suits, even in the heat, walked with a calm that came from being feared, and never seemed hungry. The boy watched them closely, those men who ruled without crowns, who gave orders with glances. He didn't yet know their names, but he could feel their power. It moved through Palermo like an unseen tide. The city was alive with contradictions, prayers echoing from churches where saints looked down at sinners, children playing in alleys where blood had dried and vanished into dust. Tommaso learned early that the world was not fair, but it was predictable. Those who had power kept it by silence and loyalty. Those who didn't served. His mother prayed for him. His father worked long hours, hands torn from labor, eyes dulled by exhaustion. But even as a child, Tommaso's gaze was restless. He looked at the world not with despair, but with hunger, not just for food, but for meaning. The 1930s were not kind to Sicily. The Great Depression reached across the sea, and poverty tightened its grip. But in that scarcity, another kind of wealth flourished. The wealth of control, of fear, of the quiet brotherhood that called itself Cosa Nostra. In the markets, men spoke of them with both reverence and caution. They protect, some said. They punish, others whispered. Tommaso listened. He saw how men bowed their heads when certain names were mentioned. He saw how disputes ended when one man's hand rested gently on another's shoulder. Power didn't need to shout. It only needed to exist. As he grew older, the city became his classroom. He learned its rhythm, the sound of boots on cobblestones at dawn, the smell of rain mixing with smoke, the soft clink of coins passing between hands. He ran errands for men whose faces were always half-lit, their voices calm and deliberate. They treated him kindly, but never casually. Even their kindness had weight. It was an invitation and a warning. The boy understood this language without words. He began to admire them, their elegance, their control, their quiet certainty. When Tommaso turned 14, he left school. Books could no longer teach him what he wanted to know. He found work in the small bars where men gathered to talk business, real business, the kind that made the city move. He served them drinks, carried messages, and pretended not to listen. But he listened to everything, every name, every rumor, every promise. He watched deals made with a nod and broken with a glance. It was a world of invisible laws, where loyalty was gold and betrayal was death. Palermo in those years was like a painting darkened by smoke, beautiful but stained. The air tasted of salt and sign. Tommaso learned how to walk with purpose, how to keep his voice low and his eyes steady. He was polite, respectful, but never submissive. Those who noticed him began to test him, small favors at first, harmless errands. Deliver this envelope. Watch that man. Speak to no one. Each task pulled him deeper into a world that didn't forgive mistakes. Yet he never flinched. There was something in him, a mix of charm and coldness that made men trust him. He was still a boy, but his silence carried the weight of a man. His first crime wasn't born of greed, but necessity. It was small, a stolen shipment, a favor done for a friend. But in Palermo, small things grew fast. One act led to another, until favors became obligations, and obligations became debts that could only be paid in loyalty. Tommaso began to understand that the Mafia wasn't just an organization, it was a way of life. It replaced the government that ignored them, the church that preached forgiveness but feared confrontation, and the poverty that demanded submission. To join, it was not just to gain power, but to gain identity. It gave meaning to men who had none. He walked the streets at night, the lamps glowing faintly through the mist. He heard distant music, an accordion, a laugh, the quiet cry of someone who had lost too much. The city never slept. It dreamed restlessly, haunted by its own past. And within those dreams, Tommaso began to find his place. He learned that fear could be useful, that respect was just fear dressed in admiration. He learned to lie without guilt, to smile without warmth, and slowly he became invisible, not unseen, but untouchable. By his early 20s, Buscetta had made friends in dangerous places. He had earned his way into circles that once seemed unreachable. Men began to call him loyal, a word that carried more power than any title. He wasn't rich yet, but he was respected. And in Palermo, Respect was the currency of survival. He would sit outside at night, looking out at the skyline, the domes of churches, the flicker of lamps, the vast silence that covered the sleeping city. Somewhere in that darkness, he felt destiny calling. He didn't know it yet, but the same world that raised him would one day tremble under his words. The code he lived by, honor, silence, loyalty, would become the very weapon that tore it apart. But for now, he was just a young man standing on a hill above Palermo, the wind carrying the scent of oranges and rain. The city stretched below him, ancient, cruel, and beautiful, and as he watched the lights shimmer across the rooftops, Tommaso Buscetta whispered a quiet promise to himself that he would rise from these streets. No matter what it cost him, by the time Tommaso Buscetta reached manhood, the streets of Palermo had changed. The city had rebuilt itself after the war, but its wounds were only covered, not healed. Cafes buzzed again with music and laughter, but beneath the rhythm of daily life, the same old shadows remained, the quiet pulse of Cosa Nostra. The Mafia had survived the bombs, the soldiers, the hunger. It had adapted, as it always did, finding power in places where law and faith could not reach. Tommaso was now part of that hidden rhythm. No longer a boy running errands, he had earned a seat among men who spoke softly and ruled completely. They trusted him, or as much as one could be trusted in a world built on secrets. He dressed sharply, carried himself with quiet dignity, and smiled the kind of smile that could end an argument before it began. He was elegant in a way that disarmed suspicion, a gentleman with eyes that never stopped measuring. People said he could speak to priests and killers with the same calm. He was both bridge and blade, a man who could shake your hand and decide your fate in the same moment. The 1950s in Sicily were years of uneasy prosperity. America was sending money, rebuilding the broken bones of Europe. Palermo was alive again, cars gleamed, hotels rose, and men like Buscetta found new opportunities hidden in the reconstruction. But along with the promise of renewal came something poisonous. The old dawns, the ones who had ruled with a sense of order, were fading. In their place rose a younger breed, men who didn't believe in the old codes of silence and respect. They believed in profit, in power for its own sake. They trafficked in something new, something that could cross oceans faster than Whisper's heroin. Buscetta watched it spread like smoke across the island. The meetings that once carried the dignity of ancient rituals now stank of greed. He saw men who used to kiss the hands of their elders now shouting over shipments, counting money like beggars. For him, Cosa Nostra had always been a strange kind of religion, built on loyalty, honor, and an unspoken belief that crime could still have rules. But the new generation no longer cared for such illusions. They had no patience for honor. There were moments when Buscetta still believed the old ways could survive. Weddings, for example, those elaborate gatherings where alliances were sealed not with ink but with wine and blood. He attended one such wedding in the hills above Palermo. The sun burned gold across the vineyards. Laughter echoed through the valley. But beneath the music, he could sense the tension. Every handshake was a negotiation, every smile a performance. The bride's father was an old friend, the groom a rising name in the new order. As they danced, Buscetta noticed the men at the table behind them. Young, restless, impatient. Their suits were newer, their eyes colder. They didn't look at the elders with respect, but with calculation. Later, that night, when the music had faded, Buscetta walked outside. The air was heavy with the scent of lemons and gun oil. Somewhere, a dog barked, and the sound carried across the valley like a warning. He thought of his own family, his wife and children, the fragile peace he'd built between two worlds, the world of family and the world of the familiar. He wondered how long such balance could last. His charm had always protected him. It allowed him to move between factions, to mediate where others would draw knives. But charm was no shield against change. In the back rooms of Palermo's bars, young men whispered of expansion, America, South America, Brazil. They wanted to move the business beyond Sicily, to make Cosa Nostra global. Buscetta understood the ambition, but he saw the danger too. Power without honor was chaos, and chaos was coming. He still held on to the old codes. The idea that a man's word meant something, that blood could bind but also curse. He remembered the oaths he had taken: never betray, never speak, never act without permission. The rituals had seemed sacred once: the prick of a finger, the burning of a saint's image, the whispered promise to die before dishonor. But now those promises were traded like currency. Loyalty had become another word for convenience. Tommaso's loyalty, however, was real. It was not born from fear, but belief. He truly thought Cosa Nostra could be something noble, brutal, yes, but principled. And yet, even he began to sense the rot beneath the surface. Deals were being made that violated every tradition. Families were killing families over territory. The streets of Palermo, once ruled by quiet respect, were becoming hunting grounds. One night, sitting in a dim cafe on Via Maqueda, Buscetta listened as two young men spoke, recklessly about profits and routes to New York. They mentioned names he didn't recognize. Men with no lineage, no history, just ambition. Their voices were eager, hungry. He felt a coldness inside him as he realized that the mafia he had devoted his life to was changing into something monstrous. It was no longer about survival or protection. It was about domination. He finished his espresso, left a coin on the table, and stepped into the night. The street lamps flickered in the humid air, and the city hummed with distant noise. He walked slowly, his thoughts heavier with every step. In a world built on silence, he could almost hear the sound of something breaking, the old vows, the ancient loyalties. He didn't say it aloud, but the words formed quietly in his mind. When honor fades, men like me have no country left at that moment. Buscetta understood something fundamental. He could not save the world he had helped build. He could only watch it unravel, one betrayal at a time. And though the night around him was warm, a chill ran through him. It was the cold of recognition, the knowledge that he was no longer at home in the kingdom he had once served. He looked out over the city, the orange glow of streetlights washing the old stone buildings. Palermo was still beautiful, still alive, but different now, like a face aged too quickly, marked by too many secrets. He lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and let the smoke rise into the dark. The future was coming, and it smelled of blood and money. And somewhere in that future, Buscetta's fate was already waiting, the first cracks of exile forming quietly beneath his feet. Rio de Janeiro, a city that glows even when it sleeps. The air hangs heavy with salt and sweetness, the sound of distant drums rolling across the hills. It is here, among the golden lights and restless nights, that Tommaso Buscetta begins again, or tries to. He arrives with the kind of silence that only fugitives carry. A man who has lost everything except his instinct to survive. The sea air tastes different here, wilder, forgiving in its warmth. In Palermo, The wind had carried the scent of gunpowder and orange peel. In Rio, it carries the perfume of ocean spray and mangoes ripening under the sun. The language is strange to him at first. Soft where Sicilian is sharp. Musical where his old world was heavy with threat. He listens more than he speaks. That, after all, is how he has always survived. He tells the world he is a businessman, a trader, a man with connections, perhaps, but harmless. He rents an apartment overlooking the bay, a place of glass and quiet luxury, far above the noise of the streets. From his balcony, he watches the waves break endlessly against the shore, their rhythm both comforting and cruel. Every wave is the same, and yet never the same. It reminds him of himself forever repeating, forever pretending. In Brazil, Tommaso becomes a ghost dressed in elegance. He frequents the cafes where foreign businessmen gather, speaks Italian softly over crystal glasses of cachaca, and smiles with the kind of charm that makes people curious, then cautious. He moves through Rio's glittering underworld with the confidence of a man who knows how to disappear in plain sight. But the nights are long in Rio, and silence, he discovers, is not peace. Sometimes he walks alone through the narrow streets of Lapa, where the smell of roasted meat mixes with the sound of laughter and music spilling from bars. He watches the dancers, their bodies moving freely, unburdened by guilt or fear. He envies them. Every movement, every note of samba feels like a rebellion against the kind of darkness he carries. He begins to build again, not an empire of bullets and fear, but of quiet influence. Old contacts in Italy, whispers through intermediaries, small deals that grow into larger ones. He invests in shipping, in restaurants, in whatever can keep the illusion alive. And yet every success feels hollow, like building a palace out of sand. The truth, though buried deep, follows him like a shadow at noon.night. He dreams of Sicily, not of the men he left behind, but of the streets, the cracked stones beneath his feet, the warmth of the sun against the walls, the faint echo of church bells calling through the afternoon haze. He wakes to the sound of tropical birds and the smell of rain. But even here, in this paradise of color and sound, the ghosts of Palermo whisper. He finds companionship easily, women drawn to his mystery, friends fascinated by his calm authority. There is laughter, dinners, the hum of conversation that fills the empty spaces of exile. Yet behind the charm, there is always calculation. Tommaso has learned that affection can be dangerous, trust even more so. Every friendship is a transaction. Every gesture of kindness hides a question. Who sent you? What do you want? Still, Rio seduces him. The city's chaos feels familiar, its beauty and danger intertwined. He learns to love its unpredictability, its rhythm that asks nothing of him but to keep moving. And for a while, he does. He becomes invisible again, as he once was in Palermo, not through fear, but through mastery. But time, he knows, is a circle, and circles always close. The Italian authorities haven't forgotten him, nor have his old associates. Word travels always. Even oceans cannot drown the whispers of Cosa Nostra. Someone recognizes him in a restaurant, or perhaps at a casino table. Perhaps it's just a coincidence, or perhaps it's fate catching up. Dressed in a new suit, he notices it first in the way strangers linger a moment too long, the way a car remains parked outside for hours, the way a letter arrives with no return address. The rhythm of Rio begins to shift. What once felt like freedom now feels like the slow tightening of a net. Tommaso understands. A man like him cannot simply vanish. He carries too many secrets, too many names. He knows what others would kill to forget. He is, in every sense, the man who knows too much. He moves again, different apartments, different names. Yet even as he runs, there's a strange calm within him. It is the calm of a man who knows the inevitable is near. He has lived long enough to understand that every escape carries the seed of capture. Every exile is just a pause in the story. One evening, as the sun sets over Guanabara Bay, he stands on his balcony, watching helicopters glide lazily above the coastline. The sky burns orange, and for a brief moment, the sound of the blades blends with the music drifting up from the city, a strange harmony of man and machine. He closes his eyes and thinks of Palermo, of narrow alleys, of vows spoken in candlelight, of blood oaths sealed with fire. He had tried to leave that world behind, but it had followed him across an ocean, hidden in the folds of his memory. When the helicopters circle again, lower this time, he knows. The ghosts of his past have arrived. The air feels heavy, electric. He doesn't move. There is no need. The game is over, or perhaps it has simply changed shape as the lights of Rio flicker on below. Tommaso Buscetta exhales one final time, slow and measured. The sound of the waves fades into the distance. Somewhere the samba continues, wild, free, indifferent, and in that moment, before the door bursts open, before the noise and chaos of fate reclaim him, Buscetta understands the truth. He had spent his life denying you cannot run. From an oath made in blood, the ghosts of Palermo have crossed the ocean. The plane touched down in Rome, beneath a slate sky heavy with rain. It was the kind of rain that didn't pour, but lingered, thin, persistent, and cold, as if the heavens themselves had grown weary of forgiveness. Tommaso Buscetta stepped off the aircraft with the slow gait of a man who had known too many homes and too many prisons. The Brazilian sun had once bronzed his skin, softened his edges, made him believe in distance as salvation. But now the chill of Italy bit through his coat, reminding him that no ocean was wide enough to drown memory. He was back where it all began, and where it would, inevitably, end. They took him not to a courtroom, but to a cell. The Sicilian police, weathered men with cigarette-stained fingers and hollow eyes, stared at him as though studying a myth that had come to life. They saw the legend, the ghost who had danced through the Mafia's shadowed corridors, who had vanished and reappeared like smoke. But to them, legends meant nothing. They wanted names, secrets, confessions. They wanted to break him. The cell smelled of rust and rain-soaked concrete. Water dripped from the ceiling in a steady rhythm, tick, 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 marking time like a metronome of despair. He sat on the cold bench, hands cuffed, staring at the small barred window. Beyond it, the rain slid down the glass like tears that no one would claim. The world outside blurred, indistinguishable, a smear of grey and regret. The interrogations came in waves. They asked, demanded, shouted, pleaded. He said little. His silence wasn't defiance, it was exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying too many ghosts. He had seen what loyalty had bought him: exile, betrayal, and the blood of his own children. Somewhere in Palermo, they found his sons, not alive. The news came like a knife that cut from within. There are wounds that bleed openly, and those that do not. His was the latter. No tears, no outburst, just an eerie stillness that settled over him like frost. The Mafia had made its statement. Family is never out of reach. That night, when the guards closed the door behind them and left him alone, he sat in the dark and listened. The rain on the roof became a voice, soft and unending, whispering the names of the dead. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he imagined the sea, not the cruel Atlantic that carried him to Brazil, but the Mediterranean, blue and endless. The cradle of his youth, days bled into weeks. Time was no longer measured by sunlight, but by the sound of boots in the hallway, the scrape of metal trays, the distant echo of doors slamming shut. In that isolation, something began to shift inside him, quietly. The walls that once enclosed him began to feel less like punishment and more like reflection. For years, he had believed in a code stronger than morality, in a brotherhood thicker than blood. But now, that code had devoured his sons. That brotherhood had condemned him to rot. The old world, the world of Omerta, of silence and honor, had turned to dust. The torture was not in the blows or the questions, but in the remembering. Every night he lay awake, haunted by the laughter of men who once toasted his name, now feasting over his ruin. He recalled their faces in smoke-filled rooms, their promises whispered under the hum of neon lights. He thought of loyalty, how easily it bends under the weight of fear. Somewhere between those thoughts, between one drip of water and the next, a seed took root. A thought he had never allowed himself to nurture. Perhaps silence was not strength after all. Perhaps, in a world already crumbling, truth could be the only rebellion left. One morning, he was taken to a larger room, white walls, a single table, 2 chairs. A man waited for him there, younger, with clear eyes and an air of patience. Giovanni Falcone. The name would come to define an era, though neither of them could see it yet. Falcone didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply looked at Buscetta as one might look at an old soldier, with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "You've seen what this life becomes," Falcone said quietly. "You know how it ends." Buscetta said nothing, but his silence carried weight. For the first time in years, someone was speaking to him as a man, not as a criminal, not as a myth. When he returned to his cell that evening, he lay awake long after the guards had passed. The rain had stopped. In its absence, the silence felt heavier, more deliberate. He thought of Falcone's words, how it ends. For a man who had spent his life in the shadows, the idea of speaking, of naming names, of unveiling what had been hidden, was both terrifying and liberating. The Mafia had stolen everything from him, his freedom, his sons, his sense of belonging. What else was left to lose? In the darkness, his breath formed small clouds that vanished in the air. He realized, with a strange calm, that the old world, the one built on blood oaths and whispered promises, had already fallen. He was merely the last to admit it. When morning came, the guards found him sitting upright, his eyes open, a faint trace of decision etched into his face. He did not look defeated anymore. He looked resolved. That was the moment Tommaso Buscetta ceased to be a fugitive and became something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to protect but the truth. The rain began again, soft and steady, as if blessing his quiet rebellion. Outside, the grey streets of Rome gleamed under the weight of it. And far away, in Palermo, men who once drank in his honor would feel an unease they couldn't explain. The storm was coming, not of bullets or blood, but of words. And for the first time, the Mafia would learn that silence, once their greatest weapon, could also be their undoing. The room was small, unremarkable, almost anonymous. And yet, History trembled within its walls. Pale light seeped through frosted glass, pooling over the wooden table where two men sat facing each other. Between them, silence breathed like a living thing. On one side, Giovanni Falcone, calm, patient, deliberate, his pen poised not just to record words, but to capture a confession that would fracture centuries of silence. On the other, Tommaso Buscetta, older now, tired, his face carved by years of exile, loss, and the weight of things unsaid. His eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had lived too long among ghosts. When he finally began to speak, his voice was quiet, not defiant, not dramatic, but weary. Like a man describing a storm he no longer fears. Cosa Nostra, he said softly, as if naming a god that no longer answered prayers. The words hung in the air, heavy and sacred. For decades, it had been a phrase whispered in back rooms, in coded gestures and nods, a world that thrived on shadows. But here, under the steady gaze of Falcone, the silence broke. Each sentence was like a crack echoing through an ancient cathedral, where for too long, only the faithful had dared to enter. Falcone listened, not as an enemy, but as a witness to a truth that had long been forbidden. His questions were measured, his tone respectful. There was no shouting, no coercion, no theatricality. Just two men and a world collapsing between them. Buscetta spoke of hierarchies, of oaths, of invisible chains binding men across oceans. He spoke of meetings in dimly lit rooms, of hands dipped in blood and loyalty. Yet, beneath the recounting of crimes and power, there was something else, a sorrow, a mourning for a system he once believed in, now rotted from within. At times he paused, staring past Falcone, as though seeing faces no longer there, the ghosts of his sons, his brothers, his friends, all claimed by the same machine he had helped build. "They killed my blood," he said once, almost to himself. "There is no honor left in that world." It wasn't vengeance that moved him, Falcone realized, but grief, the grief of a man who had watched his entire world decay, who could no longer bear the silence that fed it. The rhythm of their exchange became ritualistic. Question, answer, silence. The silences were never empty. They were filled with memory, with reflection, with the quiet dread of men who understood the cost of every word. Outside, the world carried on, cars passing, birds calling, unaware that inside this modest room, the foundations of Cosa Nostra were being dismantled. Brick by brick, confession by confession. Falcone leaned forward, his pen moving across the page, but his eyes remained fixed on Buscetta. He knew what this meant. Every truth revealed was a death sentence, not just for the Mafia's secrecy, but perhaps for them both. Still, neither turned away. There was a strange dignity in their shared understanding, a mutual respect born not from alliance, but from courage. Falcone saw in Buscetta not just a traitor, but a man who had reached the end of illusion. As the hours stretched, the air grew heavy. The window pane fogged with the damp breath of rain outside, the world dimming into grey. Falcone offered him coffee, a small gesture of humanity. Buscetta accepted, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the cup. "You know," he murmured, "I never wanted this life to end like this. But maybe it had to." Falcone nodded, though his eyes betrayed a sadness he couldn't voice. He understood this wasn't merely testimony. It was an unburdening, an exorcism. By the second day, the confessions deepened. Names, structures, rituals, he revealed them all. For every revelation, Falcone's pen scratched quietly against paper, recording the anatomy of a secret empire. Buscetta's tone remained even, but beneath the calm there was fatigue, as if every word cost him something sacred. Occasionally, his voice would falter, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of memory. "There was a time," he whispered, "when we believed in something greater than money, a code, a balance. Now it's all gone. They have turned the family into a slaughterhouse." Falcone didn't interrupt. He understood that what he was hearing wasn't just testimony. It was history being rewritten in real time. The courage it took to speak these words was unimaginable. For the first time, the Mafia's inner sanctum was being laid bare, not by an outsider, but by one of its own architects. Every revelation was a chisel against the stone of Cosa Nostra's myth, and with each crack, Falcone could feel the tremor of something immense, the collapse of an old order. When the session ended, the two men sat in silence. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the faint scent of wet stone and earth. Falcone closed his notebook gently and looked across the table. "What you've done today," he said quietly, "it will change everything." Buscetta didn't answer. He simply looked down at his hands, old and worn, hands that had built an empire and buried sons. "Change," he said after a long pause, "is always paid for in blood." Falcone nodded. In that moment, there was no prosecutor and no witness, only two men who understood that their paths were now intertwined by fate. They would both carry the same burden, truth and the danger that came with it. As Buscetta was led back to his quarters, he glanced once over his shoulder. Falcone was still there, seated, thoughtful, the lamplight haloing his figure in gold. The faint hum of the recorder still filled the room, a quiet, steady whisper of history being preserved. And somewhere beyond those walls, in the darkened streets of Palermo, word began to spread. The code of silence had been broken. The old gods were dying, and for the first time, the men who ruled from the shadows began to feel something unfamiliar. Fear, the witness had spoken, and nothing would ever be the same again. Palermo, 1986. The city held its breath. The air was thick, a blend of tension, cigarette smoke, and the salt that drifted from the nearby sea. For years, Sicily had lived under an invisible shadow, where whispers could cost a life and silence was safer than prayer. But now, for the first time, the silence was cracking. In the heart of Palermo, inside a fortress of concrete and steel, history was being written in the language of courage. They called it the Maxi Trial, the largest mafia prosecution in human history. 475 defendants, 600 witnesses, thousands of pages of evidence. It was not just a trial. It was an exorcism of a century-old evil, played out beneath the relentless sun of Sicily. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric and heavy. A sea of faces filled the seats. Judges in their black robes, lawyers buried in paper, journalists scribbling every breath, and soldiers lining the walls, their eyes scanning for danger that might come from anywhere. The defendants sat behind reinforced glass, their expressions ranging from defiance to emptiness. They were the barons of the underworld, men who once ruled cities with a glance. Now they looked like ghosts, trapped between their own pride and the inevitability of justice. At the center of it all was a name, Tommaso Buscetta, the man who had broken the sacred code. The traitor. He appeared on the witness stand like a man returning from the dead. Protected by bulletproof glass, His voice calm but steady, he began to speak. Each word felt like a hammer against the foundations of Cosa Nostra. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The weight of truth carried its own echo. He described meetings in the back rooms of bakeries, decisions made with nods instead of signatures, and vendettas that spanned generations. He spoke of murders ordered not in anger but in duty, of loyalty turned to dust. The courtroom sat in silence, the sound of his confession filling the air like the slow ticking of a clock counting down to the end of an era. Falcone sat nearby, watching. Every sentence, every revelation, was a risk he had chosen to bear. He knew that truth, once released, could never be contained again, and that it would come for him too. Yet he never flinched. His calm was almost unnatural, a kind of courage born from purpose. Outside the courtroom, Palermo trembled. Streets were lined with soldiers. The city moved in shadows. Mothers whispered Buscetta's name with a mixture of awe and disgust, and men avoided eye contact when discussing Falcone. Posters of the accused were torn down at night, only to reappear by morning. The Mafia, wounded but alive, sent its message through fear. A bomb in a car, a bullet through a window, a priest found dead for saying too much, and yet, amidst all that terror, something began to shift. For the first time, Sicilians spoke of justice not as an illusion, but as something they could almost touch. The trial lasted years. The testimony stretched across months of daylight and countless nights of tension. It became a ritual of reckoning, a slow, methodical peeling away of lies. Each day brought new names, new revelations, and new faces of power exposed to the light. Buscetta's presence haunted every session. His tone was never triumphant, never theatrical. He spoke like a man confessing not only the sins of others, but his own. He never asked for forgiveness. He didn't believe he deserved it. He only wanted the truth to outlive him. For Falcone, the trial was both victory and warning. He had pierced the heart of Cosa Nostra, but he knew that victory came with a price. Every headline, every success, drew him closer to the inevitable retaliation in the corridors of power. Whispers grew that Falcone was too bold, too dangerous, that perhaps the truth had gone too far. One afternoon, after another long day of testimony, Falcone stood by the window of his office overlooking the city. The sun was dipping low, painting Palermo in gold and blood. Behind him, papers rustled, the weight of hundreds of lives, hundreds of crimes, each documented in his careful hand. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible against the hum of the city below. He knew the Mafia was not gone, only cornered, Buscetta, now under heavy protection. Lived far from the island that had raised and cursed him. In his solitude, he watched the trial unfold like an echo of his own life, his words now belonging to the world, not to him. He saw himself on television screens, newspapers, whispers in cafes. To some, he was a savior. To others, a traitor who had desecrated the code of silence. In truth, he was neither. He was simply a man who had finally decided to stop lying. Months turned into years. The verdict came like thunder. Hundreds were convicted, sentences that reached into centuries. The Mafia's empire, once invisible, was named and numbered before the world. It was victory, but a fragile one, built on the courage of men who knew they were signing their own death warrants. Falcone walked out of the courtroom that day beneath the Sicilian sun, his face calm, almost serene. Reporters swarmed, questions fired like bullets. He smiled faintly, said little, and kept walking. For all his achievements, he carried no illusions. Justice, he knew, was not an ending. It was a pause between storms. As evening fell, his car moved slowly through the narrow streets of Palermo. The light was fading, shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. In the distance, the sea shimmered like a mirror to the dying sun. Somewhere in the heart of the city, a phone rang, a signal, perhaps, or a warning. But for now, all was still. Falcone's car disappeared into the Sicilian dusk, a man driving quietly toward history, unaware that the explosion was already waiting for him, written into the story he had dared to tell. And in that silence, before the blast, Sicily held its breath once more. Time has a way of softening everything, the sharp edges of fear, the roaring noise of ambition, even the pulse of violence that once defined a man's life. Yet for Tommaso Buscetta, time did not bring peace. It merely changed the shape of his torment. Years passed, oceans away from Sicily, yet the ghosts crossed borders as easily as his mind wandered back to Palermo. He lived under a new name, behind high walls, surrounded by faceless guards who called him sir but never looked too long. He had betrayed a brotherhood built on silence, and though he had survived the Mafia's wrath, he could not escape the echo of his own conscience. At night, when the world outside his safe house quieted, he would sit by the window and watch the streetlights stretch long and thin across the asphalt. In those amber reflections, he saw faces, men he once drank with, laughed with, buried. The ghosts were polite at first, distant silhouettes keeping their distance. But as years grew heavy, they came closer, whispering names, promises, curses. He had traded the shadow of death for the slow decay of memory. The man who once moved like smoke through Palermo's underworld now shuffled like a weary ghost through suburban America. His hair turned white, his gait unsteady, but his eyes, those dark, burning eyes, still held the glint of someone who had seen too much. In his loneliness, he began talking to himself, not in madness, but in confession. "What is honor?" he would murmur, his voice trembling under the weight of unspoken truths. "If all it does is destroy what you love most." The world he once belonged to had vanished, the Cosa Nostra of his youth, bound by ritual and ancient codes, had dissolved into greed and chaos. Young men with loud mouths and louder guns replaced the quiet killers who once swore by the word Omerta. The Mafia was no longer a brotherhood, but a business, and business cared little for honor. Buscetta watched from afar as the empire crumbled. Bosses imprisoned, soldiers slaughtered, loyalty auctioned for power. He should have felt vindicated, perhaps even relieved. But what he felt was emptiness, a vast echoing void where belonging used to live. He had lived by the code, broken the code, and outlived it all. Yet survival, he realized, is not victory. It is merely the longest punishment. He thought of Falcone, the judge who had listened to him without fear, who had believed in something purer than revenge. Falcone was gone now, blown apart by the very truth they had tried to protect. And in that knowledge, Buscetta felt something collapse inside him. The lines between justice and betrayal blurred. He had helped destroy the monster that made him, but in doing so, he had erased himself. Sometimes, on winter nights, he would walk through quiet American streets, the cold air biting his skin, the hum of distant traffic sounding almost like the Sicilian Sea. In those moments, he imagined the men of his past walking beside him, Rena, Inzerillo, and the nameless soldiers buried in unmarked graves. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Their silence accused him more than any bullet ever could. He would stop under a street lamp and light a cigarette with trembling hands. The smoke curled upward, fragile and grey, like the last breath of an era. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled, watching the smoke dissolve into the night, as if erasing proof that he had ever existed. Buscetta lived long enough to see his story twisted, romanticized, and judged by strangers. Some called him a hero, others a traitor, but none truly knew the man behind the myth. In the end, the truth was simpler and sadder. He had loved his world too much to let it live, and hated it too much to mourn its death. He once told an interviewer, "I didn't betray Cosa Nostra, it betrayed itself." But the tone in his voice betrayed something else. Regret, perhaps even longing. The kind of longing only a man with blood on his hands and love in his heart could ever understand. Years later, when he was old and sick, Buscetta would close his eyes and hear the sea again, the same sea that had watched over Palermo, the same that had swallowed so many secrets. In his mind, he stood on a pier at dusk, the wind carrying salt and memory through his thinning hair. The sun bled into the horizon, and he thought of all the men who had called him brother, all the sons he had lost, all the oaths he had broken. The world around him faded, and only the whisper of waves remained. In that moment, the man who had once been the bridge between silence and confession finally understood that honor was not a word carved by men. It was a ghost, eternal and weightless, haunting those who tried to possess it. And as darkness settled around him, Tommaso Buscetta became what he had always feared and perhaps always been, a ghost himself, walking forever through the mist between loyalty and loss. By the time the world began to forget his name, Tommaso Buscetta had already outlived his enemies, his friends, and perhaps even his own legend. In the quiet corners of an American suburb, a man once feared across continents now lived behind a garden fence, surrounded by silence and the occasional rustle of wind through palm trees. His days unfolded in slow repetition. Breakfast at dawn, the sound of coffee bubbling, the faint hum of distant traffic. The world outside had moved on, but for Buscetta, time had turned inward. It no longer counted days or years, only memories. Each morning he rose, as if replaying a ritual, not of crime or faith, but of survival. He had become a myth told in whispers, the man who broke the code of Omerta, who stood in court and spoke against the empire that once crowned him as one of its own. Journalists came and went, chasing fragments of the story that had already been told too many times, yet never completely. They saw a relic, a fading figure wrapped in contradiction. Some described him as a hero who dared to challenge the darkness. Others called him the greatest traitor the Mafia had ever known. But the truth, like all truths in his life, lay somewhere between the two, a truth as fragile and ambiguous as his trembling hands in interviews. His voice was slow, distant, marked by an accent that carried both nostalgia and fatigue. "I never betrayed honor," he would say softly. "I betrayed dishonor." Yet even as the words left his lips, he seemed unconvinced by their comfort. He knew how stories worked, how people turned men into symbols, how time polished blood into myth. And so he began to tell his own version, shaping his past into something that might resemble redemption. Not because he wanted forgiveness, but because he wanted to understand himself before the curtain finally fell. As he aged, his reflection became a stranger. The sharpness in his gaze dulled, the confidence of a man who once commanded armies, now buried beneath layers of regret. At night, he sat alone with a small lamp illuminating the table before him. A table cluttered with papers, old clippings, and faded photographs of a Palermo that no longer existed. The city of his youth had been a place of ritual and shadow, of loyalty that both protected and destroyed. In one of those photographs, he saw himself young again, dark hair slicked back, suit pressed, a half smile on his lips. A man who thought he could control the tides of fate. He stared at that image for a long time, tracing the edges of the photograph with a finger that trembled slightly. Who was that man? He whispered. And what did he believe in? The world around him had become quieter, but the noise inside his head never truly stopped. He still dreamed of Sicily, not the real one, but the Sicily of his memory. Lemon trees in bloom, sea air thick with salt, and the sound of church bells echoing through narrow streets. He dreamed of the faces he had loved and lost, of the sons who died because of the life he had chosen, of Falcone's calm eyes in the courtroom, eyes that had seen truth and paid for it with fire. In those dreams, Buscetta walked through the ruins of an invisible city, where every building was made of memory and regret. In his final years, he spoke less. Words, he realized, had done enough damage. They had freed him, damned him, defined him. The silence now was his only absolution. Sometimes, when journalists asked what he would say to the men who still called him traitor, he would smile faintly and reply, "They are all gone. I am still here." That is answer enough. But deep down, he knew survival was not victory. It was merely the slow endurance of guilt. The contradiction that had always defined him, loyalty and treason, justice and sin, now blurred into something more delicate, almost sacred. Perhaps, he thought, betrayal itself was a form of faith, a faith in something purer than the system he once served. Maybe to break a corrupt code was, in its own way, to honor what it was meant to protect. Yet the thought offered no peace. It only deepened the ache of understanding. One evening, as the light faded to gold and shadows stretched long across his small yard, Buscetta sat quietly in his chair, an old photograph resting in his lap. It was a picture of Palermo taken decades ago, the harbor glowing under a summer sun, boats lined up like sleeping animals, the hills beyond hazy with dust. His eyes softened. "Beautiful," he murmured, though whether he meant the city or the past itself, no one could say. Then he leaned forward slightly, as if speaking to someone unseen, and whispered something the room could not hear. A final confession, perhaps, or maybe a promise to no one but the ghosts. Moments later, the wind moved through the open window, carrying the faint scent of rain. The photograph fluttered once, then settled against his chest. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, low and steady, the kind of sound that feels like the earth remembering itself. And in that fading light, Tommaso Buscetta, the man who had lived between truth and silence, love and betrayal, kept his last oath, not to a family or a code, but to the memory of what he once was. The King of Shadows exhaled his final breath, and with it, the story of Cosa Nostra's conscience drifted quietly into the night. It begins, once again, with the rain. Soft, deliberate, endless, falling over Palermo like a confession whispered to the earth. The city lies beneath a grey sky, its rooftops slick with memory, its narrow streets echoing with footsteps that belong to no one anymore. The rain drips down balconies heavy with rust, slides along the cracked faces of statues, and pools in the hollows of cobblestone lanes where stories once began and ended in silence. Palermo breathes, slower now, older, but still alive, as if the air itself remembers the weight of its ghosts. Years have passed since Tommaso Buscetta's death. The newspapers that once printed his name in bold have long turned to dust. The world, impatient as always, moved on to other scandals, other betrayals. Yet here, in the city where he was born, his shadow lingers. It does not walk the streets or haunt the churches, but drifts quietly through the rhythm of the rain, a sound that feels like his legacy. For Palermo, the past is never truly gone. It seeps through walls, into the pores of the living, into the eyes of those who still look for meaning in what remains. The people speak of him rarely now. To some, he is a ghost of shame. To others, a necessary wound, the man who tore open the silence of Cosa Nostra and exposed what lay beneath. But time, in its strange mercy, has softened the edges of judgment. His betrayal has become part of the myth itself, another thread woven into Sicily's long, tangled tapestry of honor and ruin. The rain doesn't choose sides. It falls evenly over saints and sinners alike, washing all names into the same forgotten sea in the heart of the city. Near the harbor stands a small cafe that has outlasted everything: wars, storms, generations. Inside, an old man sits by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. He remembers when the newspapers showed Buscetta's face, proud, haunted, defiant. He remembers the whispers in the marketplace, the fear that came with every new arrest, every explosion, every funeral procession. Now, only the rain speaks for them all. It speaks in soft syllables, like an old language that only the city understands. Outside, the bells of Palermo's churches toll with the slow patience of time itself. The city that once trembled under the weight of mafia blood now stands quiet, rebuilt, yet never fully healed. The judges who dared to challenge that empire, Falcone, Borsellino, and so many others, live on in murals and monuments, their faces painted in color against walls that once hid the darkness. And somewhere in that vast and fragile memory, Buscetta's voice still echoes, not as a hero or a villain, but as a question that history never stopped asking. What is loyalty when the truth itself is broken? The rain continues, tracing lines down the marble of old cathedrals, slipping into the cracks of forgotten graves. Somewhere beneath those stones lies the secret heartbeat of Sicily, a place where crime and conscience once danced together in the shadows. Perhaps Buscetta understood that better than anyone. He saw the end coming before the others did. He knew that the world he had built his life upon, the world of oaths, silence, and invisible laws, was already crumbling from within. His choice to speak was not courage, nor cowardice, but inevitability. Like rain, truth finds a way through even the hardest stone. And yet, the paradox remains. Those who destroy a system become part of its legend. Buscetta did not just betray Cosa Nostra. He became one of its final storytellers. In the end, every empire falls not with a bang, but with a confession, and his confession was the first sound of the old world breaking. Now, Palermo stands under its eternal sky, caught between mourning and rebirth. The sea hums softly beyond the port, swallowing the city's secrets as it always has. Somewhere, a young boy runs through the puddles, laughing, unaware that the streets beneath his feet were once soaked in blood and silence. Life has returned, fragile but stubborn, growing again from the soil of tragedy. As the rain eases into mist, the horizon begins to fade. The light turns silver, and for a brief moment, the city seems suspended between the living and the dead. It's easy to imagine him there, not as the feared Don Messino or the infamous traitor, but simply as an old man watching the rain. Perhaps he is walking along the harbor one last time, hands in his pockets, the wind brushing against his face. Perhaps he is listening to the sound of water against stone, to the breathing of his city, to the silence he once broke, because that is where his story ends, not in revenge or justice, but in stillness, in the quiet acknowledgement that everything he fought, loved, and lost has dissolved into memory. Palermo will go on. The rain will fall again. And somewhere between the drops, the echo of his voice will return, faint, uncertain, but eternal. In the end, it was not justice or vengeance that outlived him. It was not the trials, or the headlines, or the whispered arguments of history. It was something softer, more enduring, the echo of a man's voice breaking the silence that built the world. A single sound carried by rain over Palermo.